She was just 50 feet from the front gate. That's what haunts me. It was a warm Tuesday in May, just past 1 in the afternoon. Sunlight on the sidewalk, tulips blooming under Mrs. Hensley's window box, the sound of a screen door creaking shut. And my daughter, 9 years old, pink backpack on her shoulders, walking home like she always did, until she didn't. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed close to your life. Every click helps bring someone else's memory back to the surface. My name is Sarah Whitlow. I was 35 that spring. I worked mornings at a diner on Route 47, the kind of place that still served liver and onions on Thursdays and let regulars keep their own coffee mugs behind the counter. My husband, Jake, was between contracts that year doing mostly handyman work around town. And Mia, our girl, she was the kind of kid who named her dolls after animals and insisted on packing her own lunch. We lived on Maple Avenue, small town, eastern Pennsylvania. You probably know the kind, 2-story colonials with weathered porches, wine chimes, mailboxes shaped like birds. People still waved to each other back then. Kids rode bikes without helmets. It was quiet. Safe. That's what we all believed. Every school day was the same. The bus dropped Mia at 1:15. She'd walk from the corner cross in front of Mrs. Hensley's yard, then turn into the Garcia's driveway. Linda Garcia watched her for us until I got off my shift. Same route, same routine, every day. That afternoon, Linda had already set out a plate of crackers and apple juice for her. Mia never showed. The first I heard was a voicemail. Linda's voice steady, but not calm. She said, "Hey Sarah, just checking. Did you get off early today? Mia's not here yet, and I thought maybe..." She trailed off. That was at 1:42 p.m. I remember standing in the diner's walk-in cooler holding a tub of sliced tomatoes and feeling something cold sink straight through my chest. I called home. No answer. I called again. Nothing. By 2:00, I was back on Maple Avenue, still wearing my apron. Linda met me outside, her eyes wide and red. We both looked up the street at once, like maybe she'd just appear, pink backpack pigtails bouncing, holding that beat-up stuffed dog she carried everywhere. But all we saw was the sidewalk. There were no tire tracks, no broken branches, no sound but the birds and the distant buzz of a neighbor's mower. The sun was still out, bright and warm, but the air didn't feel right. And for the first time since she was born, I couldn't say where my daughter was. Linda didn't raise her voice, but I heard the urgency in it as soon as she said my name again. I dropped my purse just inside the front door and ran. By the time I reached the end of our driveway, she was already halfway across the street holding Mia's juice box in one hand, the unopened crackers in the other. Her eyes scanned up and down Maple Avenue, back and forth, like maybe she'd just missed something obvious. But I could tell she already knew. I think we both did. Mrs. Hensley was still outside, standing in her garden hose forgotten at her feet. Her eyes were locked on the corner where the school bus always stopped. She said Mia had waved at her. Smiled even. That was the last anyone saw her. I walked that whole stretch myself, sidewalk to sidewalk, while Jake called the school. Linda went inside to check again, even though we knew. There wasn't a single sound on the street except for the distant clatter of a lawn crew somewhere 2 blocks over. It was like time had flattened. When I got back to the house, Mia's bedroom door was wide open. Her bed still messy from that morning, her shoes lined up in pairs beneath the window. Her pajamas from the night before were folded neatly at the foot of her bed. She'd started doing that on her own, proud of growing up. There was a Polaroid of us on her nightstand, one she'd taken herself by accident. The 3 of us blurry and smiling, standing too close. I sat down on the edge of her bed and held that picture until I heard the first knock at the door. Officer Bell was the first one on scene. He asked a few questions. When had I last seen Mia, who usually walked her home, what time the bus arrived. He scribbled down every answer, nodding gently, repeating things back as if trying to will the facts into something useful. Within half an hour, the chief dispatcher had called in a full search. Millfield wasn't a big place, but it was the kind of town where you didn't lose a child and not move heaven and earth. Volunteers started arriving before sunset. Off-duty teachers, church friends, retired men with flashlights and radios. One of the Garcias brought over thermoses of coffee and handed them out like it was snowstorm season. Jake organized routes and section maps on the hood of a squad car, drawing circles in red grease pencil like it meant something. People moved slow and careful heads down flashlights, sweeping in wide arcs. No one said the word abduction, not out loud, but I saw it in every face. They searched the woods behind the elementary school, the drainage ditches off Hillcrest, the trails behind the Methodist church. One neighbor climbed into the culvert beneath Route 11 with a rope tied around his waist. Nothing. Not a backpack, not a shoe, not a single footprint. Detective Karen Collins came that second night. She was calm, firm, mid-40s, with dark hair clipped back and a voice like she didn't scare easy. She didn't say much at first, just asked if she could sit with me while I went over the day again. She didn't take notes, just listened. I told her everything, and when I got to the part where Linda called the house and no one picked up something and her shifted, she asked if anyone had ever made us uncomfortable in the neighborhood, if Mia had mentioned anything strange or had a fight at school. I shook my head. We didn't have enemies. Nothing like that. She was just a kid who liked peanut butter crackers and played with the same doll she'd had since she was 5. But something had happened to her. We all knew it. By the third day, the state police were involved. Helicopters swept low over the tree lines, their blades thudding loud enough to rattle windows. K-9 units came up from Harrisburg. They followed scent trails to nowhere. Some led right up to the intersection near the school, then vanished, like she'd walked off the edge of the world. I remember standing on the porch with a cup of coffee I never drank, watching the early sun glint off a line of parked cruisers. Mrs. Hensley stood in her window that morning with the curtain pinched between 2 fingers, the hose still coiled useless in her yard. Everything about our street felt different. The mailboxes, the sidewalks, even the air. It was like the whole place had been hollowed out. Around day 5, Linda brought over a casserole and couldn't even look me in the eye. She'd started apologizing every time she saw me, even though none of this was her fault. She said something about wishing she'd walked out to meet Mia that day, even though she never had before. Guilt sticks to people in strange ways. Day 8 brought the first break, or what we thought was one. 2 teenage boys came forward, Marcus Chun and his younger brother Tyler. They'd been skateboarding near the elementary school that afternoon. They said they saw a little girl who looked like Mia get into a dark red sedan. Said it had out-of-state plates. Tyler remembered maybe New York. Marcus said the girl didn't seem scared, that she got in like she knew the driver. Detective Collins had them both go over it again separately. Marcus was sure. He described the car's make and the bumper sticker. Said the man driving it waved at her like it was all normal. That changed everything. The search radius expanded fast. Now it wasn't just about Millfield. Road signs went up in 4 counties. Flyers printed with Mia's face and the red backpack we now knew she'd had on. Police units coordinated with highway patrol. Truckers got the word out across state lines. A hotline was opened. Still nothing. No red car spotted. No driver questioned. The tip faded like the others. We couldn't even prove it was her. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't know what to believe anymore. On the 9th day, Collins sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me something that stuck with me for years. She said, "People don't vanish. They get taken, or they go willingly, but they don't just disappear." Then she looked down at her coffee like she regretted saying it. That night, Jake sat on the porch until almost midnight, watching the end of our street with a flashlight across his knees. I asked him what he was looking for. He said, anything that doesn't belong. But it all looked normal. That was the worst part. Everything looked normal. They told me not to panic, that sometimes kids wander off and come back on their own, that maybe Mia had gotten distracted, taken a detour to a friend's house, or even gotten upset and decided to cool off somewhere. I remember Detective Collins standing in my kitchen that evening, her voice low and measured, saying they were treating it seriously, but that we needed to keep all possibilities open. I nodded, but it didn't sit right. Mia wasn't impulsive. She didn't storm off when she was upset. And she never went anywhere without telling someone. Linda backed me up on that, but it didn't seem to matter. The tone shifted subtly but clearly. A question here. A pause there. Had Mia been upset that morning? Was she close with her stepfather? Had there been any discipline at home? I felt it beginning to turn. One officer asked if she had ever run away before. I asked him how many 9-year-olds he'd known who ran away with a backpack full of school books and a half-eaten sandwich. He didn't answer. Jake noticed it too. One night, after everyone had cleared out, he stood at the sink scrubbing a coffee mug long past clean and said, "They're looking at us now." And he wasn't wrong. They searched the house again. Not just Mia's room this time, but ours too. Closets, drawers, under the bed, even the laundry chute in the hallway. They asked to see our phones. Wanted to know who we'd called, who we hadn't. A detective took Jake aside for a separate conversation that lasted nearly an hour. When he came back in, he didn't say anything. Just sat down at the kitchen table and stared out the window like something had drained out of him. I understood it. They were trying to rule things out. That's what they said. But it felt like being slowly erased from the circle of people who were allowed to grieve. Even Mrs. Hensley, who'd seen Mia walk by that afternoon, was treated more like a bystander than a witness. She kept apologizing, said she wished she'd walked Mia home. She couldn't have known. But it didn't stop the guilt. The thing is, when nothing turns up after those first few days, no shoe, no sound, no sign, people start telling themselves stories. And the police start looking for someone to hold it together, or someone to blame. I tried to stay focused, stayed up late with the phone next to me, staring at the wall until morning. Jake threw himself into the volunteer efforts, organizing maps, double-checking the areas already searched. But inside the house, we barely spoke. Not out of anger, just exhaustion. Everything we said to each other already felt rehearsed. The silence was easier. The pressure didn't come from just the police. People around town started talking gently at first. A neighbor asked if we had any family trouble. Someone else asked about Mia's biological father, even though he hadn't been in the picture since she was 3. I started getting strange looks at the grocery store, people quick to smile, but even quicker to move on. Sympathy fading into suspicion. I could feel it. One afternoon I was out getting the mail when a woman I didn't recognize pulled up in an SUV, leaned out the window and said, "You holding up okay?" I said I was doing the best I could. She nodded and said, "Well, kids don't just vanish, right?" And then she drove off. No one knew how to talk about it anymore. Most people avoided it. Some leaned too hard into theory. Theories became stories, and stories twisted into speculation. And somewhere in all of it, Mia became less of a little girl and more of a mystery. A town whisper. I remember sitting on the couch one night, flipping through the channels when a news segment came on about a missing teenager from another state. Jake muted the TV without a word. We just sat there staring at the silent screen. Even the television had nothing left to offer. The lead with the red car didn't go anywhere. No matching vehicles turned up. No traffic cams caught it. No one from out of state had been flagged in the area. The car might have been real, might have been something the boys misremembered, or maybe something more complicated. But the police didn't seem to have much faith in it. It was filed and then faded. Everything faded. About 2 weeks and Detective Collins came by with a man from the regional office. She said they were reviewing older cases in the area looking for patterns, similarities. She didn't say the word, but I could tell they were starting to consider the possibility Mia was never coming home. I asked her directly if they were still following every lead. She said yes, but her eyes said something else. That night, I pulled out every photo album we had, spread them out across the floor like maybe something inside them would help. A face, a background, a detail I'd missed. I stayed up until dawn just flipping pages. Some of the corners were starting to curl. I kept thinking, how can a child be so real and full of life one day, and then just become paper the next? When David Morrison's name came up, I didn't know what to think. He lived on the edge of town near the park. Everyone knew him, or at least knew of him. Quiet man, developmentally disabled, kept to himself. I remembered hearing he'd been caught bothering some kids at the playground, but nothing serious had ever come of it. Then suddenly Collins showed up at our door looking like she hadn't slept in days. She said they had a confession. David had told his mother that he'd hurt Mia, that he hadn't meant to, that he just wanted to say sorry for something, but things went wrong. The story didn't make sense to me, but nothing had for weeks. Collins said they were treating it seriously. They had enough to charge him. He was taken into custody, then transferred to a facility for evaluation. Just like that, the case changed. Neighbors started nodding at us again. The calls stopped coming, but so did the stares. People began saying things like, "At least now you'll have closure." I wasn't sure what closure meant. It didn't bring Mia back. It didn't rewind the afternoon. And in quiet moments, something about it didn't feel settled. David's words didn't match the timeline. His mother said he'd gotten confused. But the town needed something. The case file needed an ending. Collins looked tired when the conviction came through. She shook my hand and said we'd done the best we could. But she kept the file, said it was just in case. I didn't know what she meant by that. Not yet, but later I would. Because it wasn't over. Not really. And deep down, I think she knew that too. After the conviction, people stopped asking questions. That's what I noticed first. The whispers died down and the calls stopped coming. The flyers were taken off telephone poles. It was like the whole town exhaled at once and decided it was okay to move on. And maybe they needed to. But I didn't. I still walked Mia's route every afternoon sometimes with my coat half-zipped and her backpack slung over my shoulder like it meant something. I kept telling myself it was for closure or habit or maybe just to keep her close. Jake stopped joining me after a while. He said the walking didn't help and we grieved differently. That was true, but it wasn't the whole of it. Something had cracked between us, soft at first, like the splitting of ice before the thaw. We were still under the same roof, but it started to feel like we were on opposite ends of a sinking boat, both trying to bail water out, just not together. I stopped cooking. He stopped shaving. We said goodnight every night, but not much else. There wasn't a fight. There didn't need to be. Just silence. Long and steady. And underneath that silence, I couldn't let go of one thing, David's confession. Something about it never felt right. I told myself maybe I was just looking for reasons to stay in grief, that I couldn't accept closure even when it was handed to me. But when I read the transcript line by line, my gut wouldn't settle. His story shifted in small ways. The time of day. The place he said he approached her. His mother said he'd been confused for weeks, that he sometimes mixed up dates and details. But why then? Why confess at all? I kept coming back to the red car. The one Marcus and Tyler Chun had seen. It never lined up. David didn't drive. He didn't own a red vehicle. His mother didn't either. And there was nothing in his story about a car or about anyone else. Detective Collins had flagged that too, but when I asked her what it meant, she only said it was a loose thread not enough to unravel the case, but too strange to forget. I could tell it still bothered her. She stopped by the house a few times after the sentencing, always casual. dropping something off, asking how I was doing, sometimes just standing with me in the yard as we watched the wind stir the leaves across the sidewalk where Mia should have been. One afternoon, she said, "I still think about that backpack." And I knew what she meant. They never found it. Not the backpack. Not the doll. Not the dress she was wearing. Those things just vanished. Evidence didn't evaporate like that. Not unless someone knew exactly what they were doing. After that, she stopped coming by. A year went by, then two. Jake and I filed for divorce. Not out of spite. It just became clear that the version of us who had built a life around Mia didn't know how to stand without her. We split the furniture. I kept the house. He moved in with his brother across town. I still saw him sometimes at the grocery store driving through old shortcuts. We didn't avoid each other, but we didn't wave either. We'd become like two people who shared a memory but not a present. The seasons came and went. I painted the living room. I went back to working double shifts. I spent less time in her bedroom, though I never touched her things. I told myself that was progress, even if I didn't believe it. And still that sense that something had been missed never left me. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with the file Collins had given me. She said it was mine to keep since I had a right to all public records tied to the case. I read every word of it until the paper turned soft at the edges. And still, none of it felt like an answer. I told myself I should be grateful, that at least I had a name, that I wasn't one of those mothers who spent 30 years wondering who. But knowing who didn't mean knowing why. And not knowing why left everything open. In 2008, Collins was promoted to captain. I heard it through someone at the diner. She didn't come back to Maple Avenue after that. I imagined her at a bigger desk under fluorescent lights with newer cases that actually led somewhere. I didn't blame her. The town changed too. The Garcias moved. Mrs. Hensley passed away the winter after my divorce. The school district redrew its routes and no buses stopped at our corner anymore. The house got quieter. Even the street lights buzzed differently. I started keeping her room closed. Not locked, just quiet. I told people I was doing okay, and mostly I was. But underneath it, I still found myself looking for her in places that didn't make sense. A shadow at the park. A voice at the checkout line. I knew better. But the mind doesn't care what you know. One night I had a dream I was walking through the woods near the edge of town. The kind of trail where the ground goes soft after rain, and I found her backpack just sitting there on the path. I woke up choking on air, hands shaking, still hearing the sound of leaves brushing against nylon. I told no one, just got up, poured coffee, and went to work. That was how the days passed. No big moment, no return. Just a long, slow settling into not knowing. Until one October morning, 15 years after she disappeared, I got a call. I hadn't spoken to anyone from the department in years. But when I picked up and heard the voice on the other end steady lower than I remembered, I knew immediately. "Sarah Collins said I need you to come in. There's been a development." She didn't explain further. Just gave me a time and address, Woodland State Park, 20 minutes north. The same direction the dogs had followed all those years ago. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys and drove. The roads hadn't changed much. The trees were full and brittle the way they get before the first frost. At the ranger station, I met Collins on the steps. She looked older, but not different. Still had that sharpness behind the eyes. She said a mushroom hunter had found something near one of the less used trails. Something partially buried. A backpack, a piece of cloth, something else too. My legs went hollow. Collins didn't have to say more. I knew. Even before I saw it, even before they confirmed it, I knew. And just like that, everything came back. The silence, the questions, the parts that never fit. Because now there was something else to answer something that didn't match the confession. Something that proved what I'd feared all along. David hadn't told the whole story, and maybe he hadn't told it at all. The trail was damp from rain the night before. leaves pressed into the soft dirt like old stamps, their colors dulled, edges torn. I stood with Collins just off the main loop, a few steps into the underbrush, where the ground sloped shallowly toward the creek. A ranger had flagged the site with orange ribbon, low discreet. There was no crowd, no flashing lights, just quiet, methodical work. They'd already lifted the backpack. It was faded dirt-caked the pink, dulled nearly to beige. But I knew it was hers. The stitching on the side pocket was coming loose, same as it had been that spring. The zipper was still stuck halfway. A piece of fabric, part of a sleeve maybe, had been found nearby along with something smaller. It wasn't until they held it out carefully in gloved hands that I understood. Sarah. Her doll. Blonde hair still curled at the ends. The plastic had held up surprisingly well. The left arm was missing. I felt myself sway. Collins steadied me, no words. The medical examiner confirmed the rest that afternoon. The remains were partial but consistent. A child's. A girl's. DNA left no question. Mia had been found. But not in the way anyone had hoped, and not where David Morrison had said. He'd confessed to leaving her body near the playground in a wooded patch that had been cleared years ago. But this was 15 miles away. An area that had been searched, yes, but not thoroughly. The terrain back then was denser, full of undergrowth and brush. It was plausible. That's what Collins said. Plausible, but not right. I kept thinking about how close it was. 15 miles. We used to drive past those woods on the way to her pediatrician. I'd pointed out deer there once, and she'd asked if they had names. That night back home, I sat on the floor of her bedroom for the first time in years. I took the file back out, spread it across the bedspread like a map I didn't know how to read. Collins called the next morning. Her voice was different now, more clipped, focused. She said they'd begun comparing site evidence with the original statements, trying to square timelines. I asked what she meant. She paused, then said it outright. Sarah, the burial site doesn't match David's story. Not in location, not in condition, not in cause. It was a shock, but it wasn't. Somewhere in me, I'd known. The idea that he'd walked Mia that far alone through terrain like that with no car, no plan, and managed to bury her undetected, it never made sense. Especially not when he was known to struggle with navigation even around his own block. They brought in forensic analysts. The grave was shallow but clean. Tools had been used, something sharper than hands, something deliberate. The soil showed signs of being disturbed that same week in 2001. There were no markers, no evidence of return, which meant she had likely been buried not long after she vanished, and the area hadn't been touched since. But something else came up too. DNA. A partial profile from a second individual. Male. Not David, and not in the system. Collins explained how degraded samples worked, how soil and time could erode clarity. But what they had was enough to know this someone else had been there, someone unaccounted for. I asked her about the red car again, the one Marcus Chun and his brother had mentioned. She was quiet for a second, then said, "We're re-interviewing everyone, starting with old witnesses. It's all back in motion now." That phrase stayed with me. Back in motion. Like the wheels had never really stopped turning, they'd just slowed to almost nothing. The next week, Collins came to my door with 2 younger detectives. They asked if I remembered anything unusual about Marcus. I didn't, not really. He'd been 16 when Mia disappeared. Quiet. His brother Tyler had always done most of the talking. I remembered Marcus mostly as a blur in the background, standing a step behind, nodding while the younger one gave his account. But something new had come up. That second DNA profile, whoever it belonged to, was connected to Marcus. Not through family, but directly. The sample matched his own. They found it from archived medical records, then cross-verified it with a DNA sample from the original tip file. He'd died in a car accident 5 years earlier. Single-vehicle crash outside Allentown. No foul play, no surviving passengers. But now he was back in the middle of it. The boy who'd claimed to see Mia get into a red car might have been the one she got in with. And just like that, the story flipped. They pulled his original statement and read through it again line by line. Collins pointed out the detail about the bumper sticker, the missing hubcap. She said, "It was almost too specific, like he wanted us to stop looking anywhere else." I asked if he'd ever been considered a suspect. She shook her head. He was just a kid, and he came forward. That counted for a lot. They talked to Tyler next. He was in his 30s now, married with 2 kids living out of state. He came in voluntarily, sat down across from Collins, and this time his voice was different, less sure. He said he'd never seen the red car, that Marcus had told him what to say, that he'd believed him. But even back then, something felt wrong. Tyler said his brother scared him sometimes, that he had moods, that when Mia's face started showing up on TV, Marcus had gotten quiet, withdrawn, that he'd once made a comment, something about people not knowing what kids need to be taught. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that someone who'd inserted themselves into the search might have been the one we were searching for. That maybe all these years the answer had been sitting in the room with us. The second DNA profile was still a mystery. Not Tyler, not Jake, not anyone in the original files. They were widening the net now, pulling names from yearbooks, employment rosters, even checking driver's licenses from the time to see who Marcus might have known. They found out he'd worked a summer job the year before Mia vanished. A day camp. Local, but with staff from surrounding counties. No reports of incidents, but one counselor had left mid-season without explanation. A man named Kyle Morrison. The name stuck in my head, but I didn't place it right away. Then it hit. Morrison. David's older brother. I didn't know what that meant yet. Neither did Collins. But the thread was real now. Something had finally shifted, and for the first time in 15 years I felt like the silence might not hold. Not much longer. The name sat there on the page like it had always been part of the story, Kyle Morrison. I recognized it instantly, but I had to read it twice before the pieces started to lock into place. David's older brother. Quiet, mostly kept to himself, never really part of town life in the way his younger brother had been. I hadn't seen him in years. After David's sentencing, the Morrison family disappeared almost entirely from public view. Their mother passed away while David was still inside. The house was sold. Kyle, I assumed, had left with whatever was left of that life. But now he was back in the file, circled in pen and flagged with a yellow tab tied to Marcus Chun through an old summer job neither of them had mentioned before an outdoor day camp run out of the old Lutheran church property just past the county line. Collins found the record buried in staff logs. Nothing serious. No reported incidents. No formal complaints. Just a single note that Kyle had left the position halfway through the season. The reason column was blank. That was enough for Collins to make a call. She tracked him to Ohio. He'd been pulled over for speeding just outside Columbus, and when the officer ran his name, it flagged the Thompson case. That's how the connection surfaced. When she told me she was going out there to speak with him, I asked if I could come. She said no. Said it needed to be handled right. Legally. Carefully. I understood, but I didn't like it. For a few days, I waited without news. I tried not to dwell, but I kept thinking of all the times David's name had come up over and over, while Kyle's had vanished like fog lifting off a lake. A sibling is not a stranger. That thought stuck with me. Whatever you know about someone close to you, whatever you carry silently, it doesn't just disappear. Collins called on a Friday. She said Kyle had agreed to speak voluntarily, no lawyers, no stall tactics. She said he looked worn down. Not just older, but tired in a deeper way. She didn't explain what that meant until the next morning. Kyle had confessed. It came slowly in pieces, like someone finally letting go of something he'd carried for too long. He said Marcus had reached out to him the week before Mia disappeared, said he wanted help with something. Not to hurt her, just to scare her. Teach her a lesson, was how Kyle put it. It was something Marcus claimed his own parents had done to him once, set up a fake scenario where a stranger approached him to make a point about danger. Kyle said Marcus had always been strange about that kind of thing, always talked about fear like it was a tool, but Kyle went along with it. He said Marcus made it sound like it would be harmless, that she'd be gone an hour, maybe two, and they'd explain everything afterward. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after Collins finished telling me that. She said Kyle's voice broke when he talked about the moment in the woods, how Mia had started to cry calling for her mom, how Marcus got irritated, how his voice changed. He told Kyle she was too loud, that she was going to get them in trouble. And then something happened, something Kyle wouldn't describe. Only that 1 minute she was standing there, and the next, she wasn't. And after that he panicked. He said he helped bury her, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know what else to do. I asked Collins if he said anything about David. She said yes. Kyle admitted they'd both known David was vulnerable, that David had already been struggling. He said that when the story came out, when David was arrested and charged, he nearly came forward, but Marcus convinced him not to. Said David would be better off in a facility than in prison, that maybe he'd get help. And so they let it happen. Let him carry it. Let a man who wasn't capable of understanding what was happening believe he had done something unspeakable. And all that time the real story stayed buried with Mia. I don't know what I felt hearing all that. Rage, numbness, relief maybe. Numbness, relief. A kind of grief that had matured into something colder over the years. Collins said the confession had been recorded, that charges would be considered, that finally, we might have the truth. But when I asked if it was over, she hesitated. She said Kyle's attorney was already filing motions, that he was claiming coercion, that Kyle had been questioned too long without proper breaks and had agreed to things he didn't fully understand, that the DNA evidence while present couldn't definitively place him at the scene without contamination concerns. The same arguments that had unraveled David's case now hovered over this one. And still I believed him. I believed Kyle because his story made sense in all the ways David's never had. The location, the timing, the way she was buried, the way everything had gone silent so quickly, so cleanly. Kyle had known, and Kyle had helped. But believing and proving are two different things. That's what Collins reminded me. The DA would have to decide whether to move forward, and defense attorneys know how to dismantle old confessions, especially when the person offering them has spent nearly 2 decades trying to forget. I asked Collins if she thought he'd get away with it. She didn't answer, just looked down at her notes. Then she said, "He said one more thing." I waited. She pulled out a printed page. It was a written statement. At the bottom, a signature, Kyle Morrison. She read the last sentence aloud. I thought it was over when Marcus died. I told myself it died with him, but it didn't. It sat in the room with me every day, and when they found her, I knew I couldn't lie to her memory anymore. That line stayed with me, not because it brought comfort, but because it told me that truth has weight, and that even those who try to bury it eventually feel its hand on their shoulder. But the weight of truth doesn't always bring justice, and that part I was beginning to understand might still be out of reach. The retraction came less than 3 weeks after the confession. It was quiet at first, just a motion filed through Kyle's attorney's office claiming procedural concerns and improper detainment during the interview. Then came the press release. My client was held for over 12 hours, without rest food or legal counsel, it read. Under those conditions, anyone could be led to say things that aren't entirely accurate. I didn't need to read between the lines. The implication was clear. Kyle was taking it back. Collins called me the same afternoon the papers were filed. She didn't sound surprised, just tired. She said the recording of the confession was still intact, but it wouldn't hold without corroborating evidence. Not in court, not with the timing, not with that much room for doubt. I didn't say anything for a while. I just looked out the kitchen window at the corner where Mia had last been seen, now cracked and uneven from frost. Collins said she'd understand if I wanted to come in and listen to the tape. I told her I'd already heard enough. The story Kyle had told, that part was real. I knew it in the way a mother knows the moment her child is truly gone. But legal truth is different. It has rules, thresholds. It depends on what can be proven, not what can be known. The following week, the district attorney's office issued a formal statement. In light of the retracted confession and inconclusive physical evidence, it said we are unable to proceed with charges at this time. I read that line twice. Then I folded the letter and placed it on the bookshelf between Mia's photo albums where the paper wouldn't yellow from light. Later, when I spoke with Collins in person, she told me the forensic results from the burial site had been reviewed again. The DNA linking Kyle to the scene still held, but the chain of custody on the sample had been challenged. There were enough questions raised by the defense about storage degradation, potential transfer, that the DA believed it wouldn't survive in front of a jury. There was no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no eyewitness, no surveillance footage, no trail of digital messages. Just a confession now claimed to be false, and a name that had only emerged after more than a decade of silence. Marcus was dead. Kyle had withdrawn. And David, he was free, but hollowed out. I saw him once after the case was dropped. He was sitting alone outside the pharmacy on East Main, staring at the pavement like it owed him something. I didn't approach him. I didn't have the right. But I watched him for a minute before I turned back to my car. When I got home, I sat in Mia's room and thought about how the years had blurred the line between remembering and guessing. Whether a laugh I recalled was from that last week or from the year before. Whether the sweater still folded in her drawer had ever actually been worn or just picked out for the next day that never came. I waited for someone to call and tell me the decision had been reversed, that new charges had been filed, that someone else had come forward. But nothing happened. And when the news outlets stopped calling and the mailbox went back to holding only coupons and utility bills, I realized that this was it. This was how the truth ends, not with a final verdict, but with the quiet folding in of attention. The days got colder. The leaves went out with one last show of color, and then the trees stood bare, same as they had the year Mia disappeared. The memorial in Woodland State Park grew slowly. People left notes, candles, small trinkets. Sometimes I'd find a ribbon tied around the trunk of the nearest tree or a weathered photo tucked beneath a stone. I started visiting once a month, never with ceremony, just a walk, a few words, a way of keeping the silence from turning into forgetting. Jake and I spoke again that winter. Not much, just coffee on a Sunday afternoon. We didn't talk about Kyle, or Marcus, or what the case had become. We talked about Mia, about the way she used to tie her shoelaces into double knots so tight we had to use scissors to get them off, about how she used to name the mailboxes on our block like they were part of her neighborhood crew. There was something healing in that. Not closure, just warmth returning to frozen ground. Collins retired not long after. She stopped by the house once unannounced. She brought an envelope with a few of the photographs from the scene, the ones the department had cleared for release. She said she thought I had a right to them. I asked her if she believed Kyle had lied when he retracted his statement. She looked at me quiet for a moment, then said, "I think some people spend so long running from what they did that they start to believe the version that hurts less. That was all." She left not long after, and I haven't heard from her since. Mia would have been 32 this year. I sometimes imagine what her life might have looked like, where she would have gone, what she might have studied if she would have had her father's eyes or my hands. But those thoughts come less often now. Not because I've let go, but because I've learned to hold them differently. The truth we got was partial, incomplete. It came in a voice that couldn't be held up in court, and in evidence that fell apart the longer it sat untouched. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. The weight of what was done doesn't disappear just because it can't be prosecuted. The harm remains. So do the questions. And sometimes the questions are the only thing keeping the memory alive. Collins used to say that some cases don't close, they just stop moving. And maybe she was right. But I still believe the truth leaves traces. Even if the law can't hold them, even if time wears them thin. And I believe one of those traces is still out there. Something not yet uncovered. Something that won't stay buried. In 2024, 23 years after Mia's disappearance, I filed a civil suit against Kyle Morrison. I knew what the lawyers would say before they said it, that the case had no guarantee that I'd be risking years of litigation for an outcome that might carry no weight in the eyes of the law. But I wasn't asking the law to fix what it never finished. I just wanted the truth, or at the very least, the chance to say aloud what everyone else had quietly decided to live with. The paperwork took weeks. I sat at my dining table filling out forms with checkboxes that didn't feel made for a case like ours, boxes for damages for intent for named defendants. I remember stopping more than once, just holding the pen and staring at the line where they asked me to describe emotional impact in measurable terms. How do you measure 2 decades of silence, of birthdays marked by candles? No one blew out. I wrote one sentence. He lied, and it cost my family everything. When the court date was announced, I didn't tell many people. Jake knew. A few close friends. Most of the neighbors who had been around back then were gone now. New families had moved in, unfamiliar with the cracks running under the surface of Maple Avenue. That morning, I wore a navy sweater with Mia's initials stitched along the hem. I sat in the front row of the courtroom with my hands folded in my lap, just watching. Kyle didn't speak. His lawyer handled the response, citing lack of physical evidence, retracted statements, and the fact that no criminal charges had ever been filed against him. They called the confession a result of psychological pressure and irrelevant to the burden of civil proof. They said my grief, while tragic, did not constitute proof of wrongdoing. When the judge ruled to dismiss the case, I didn't react. I'd already grieved every version of this ending a dozen times over. Outside the courthouse, I stood on the steps while people filed past. Collins wasn't there. She'd long since retired. But I thought of her then, of her hands on that old case file, of how she once said she kept it open in her mind even after it had been closed on paper. That evening I went home and sat in Mia's room, which I still kept the way it was. Same posters, same nightlight. I reached into the top drawer and pulled out the last photograph we'd taken together, a little instant print from a school field trip. Mia's face was slightly out of frame, like she'd leaned in too fast for the shutter. Her hair was pulled into lopsided braids. She looked happy, alive, real. And more than anything, I wanted the people who had sat in that courtroom to understand that she wasn't just a case number or a question mark. She had been here. She had mattered. That weekend, I drove out to the memorial in Woodland State Park. It had changed over the years, grown larger, more permanent. There was a plaque now etched with her name surrounded by a ring of river stones. Someone had left a crocheted ribbon around the base. A child's drawing was tucked behind a candle. I didn't know who had left them. Maybe no one I'd ever met. But the fact that they were there meant something. I sat on the bench across from the tree line and talked to Mia the way I always did when I came. I told her the truth about the trial, about how Kyle had walked free again, about how I still believed what he'd said before he took it back. I told her I hadn't stopped, and I wouldn't. Not for a ruling, not for a judge, not for the people who wanted the story to end because it had gone on too long. Afterward, I took a short walk through the trail. There was a breeze that day, just enough to stir the leaves. I don't know why, but I thought of Marcus. I pictured him standing at the edge of the woods all those years ago, convincing himself it was just a scare tactic, that it wasn't real, that he could walk away from it without leaving a trail. But the truth doesn't always stay buried. Not forever. Sometimes it rises up in fragments, a backpack in the dirt, a thread of DNA, a line in a forgotten job file. And sometimes the trail it leaves is not in evidence, but in silence. The kind that follows you home, that sits in the passenger seat when you're driving and makes you take a second glance at every teenage boy walking too slow down the sidewalk. There was a part of me that still hoped someone else might come forward. Not with a confession, but maybe just a memory, a detail, a name. Something said in passing that had meant nothing at the time. But I also knew the window for that kind of miracle was closing. People forget. Records get lost. Even the strongest memories fade until you're no longer sure if what you remember is what happened or just the version that hurts the least. The detectives assigned after Collins had changed a few times. None of them called anymore. I couldn't blame them. Without new evidence, there wasn't much left to chase. Still, they hadn't marked the case closed. Not officially. That part mattered. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a folded photo, one of the public ones from the news years back. Mia in her second-grade school picture. Taped to the back was a yellow Post-it note. It said, "I remember her. I always have." No signature, no date, no explanation. Just those 8 words. I turned the envelope over again, checked the postmark. It had come from a town I didn't recognize 3 counties away. It might have been a hoax, might have been nothing, but I still have it. Folded neatly, tucked inside the same drawer that holds her drawings, her notes, her bracelets. It's not proof, not in any legal sense, but it was something, a ripple in the still water. And it told me maybe I wasn't the only one who hadn't let go. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see her on the sidewalk. Pink backpack, light in her step. A little girl just trying to get home. That's the image I've held on to all these years. Not what came after. Not what the case became, but that last moment of her just being a child, untouched by the storm that was waiting around the corner. After the letter came, I didn't chase it down. I let it sit. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I'd learned that some answers don't come when you ask. They come when you're quiet long enough to notice what hasn't left. That note, those 8 words, they didn't give me a name, but they gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. A sign that someone else remembered too. That the story hadn't faded for everyone. Jake and I talk more now, not often, but enough. We share holidays sometimes just a phone call. There's a comfort in knowing we're the only 2 people who remember every corner of that year the way it really was. No explanations needed, no smoothing of the edges. He's older now. So am I. We carry Mia between us still, but in a gentler way than before. Some grief gets louder over time. Ours softened. Made room. David never spoke publicly after his release. I don't think he wanted to. I heard he moved out west for a while, then came back. Someone said he's living quietly in a county facility now. I wonder what kind of peace he's found, if any. As for Kyle, I don't say his name out loud much anymore. It doesn't bring me anything useful. I've come to believe that people can live their entire lives beside the truth without ever looking it in the eye. That was his choice. And in a way, that's its own kind of sentence. Detective Collins and I exchanged one last letter not long after the civil case was dismissed. She thanked me for trusting her, even when the answers never came clean. I thanked her for staying when it would have been easier to walk away. She said she still thinks about Mia. Still keeps her photo on her desk even in retirement. Some cases close, she wrote. Others live on in people. I go to the memorial often. Sometimes there are new flowers. Sometimes there's nothing but the breeze and the trees and that quiet stillness that wraps around the edge of the park. I sit on the bench and tell her about the world. What's changed, what hasn't. How the sun still falls through the same trees that once kept her hidden. Mia would be grown now. Maybe with a family. Maybe traveling the world. Maybe sitting across from me at a kitchen table, coffee in hand. I think about that sometimes. Not to make myself hurt, but to remind myself of how much there was to lose. She was never just a headline or a case file. She was my daughter. And that will always be true no matter how much time has passed. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening, for holding space, for remembering. If it stayed with you, I hope you'll share it so her name keeps moving, even when everything else goes quiet. Some stories are unfinished, but that doesn't mean they're forgotten, and Mia Whitlow should never be.